child by child. When I hear people talk about vulnerable families, I know they have in mind many of the families I met first as an ethnographic researcher in New Haven, Connecticut when I was getting my PhD, and then the founding commissioner of early childhood for the state of Connecticut. I can take Jacqueline, for example. When she and I first met, she had 4 children who had attended 3 different schools spread across the city. 1 in preschool, 2 in elementary school, and the other in middle school. Mind you, this is a city in which most of its schools are pre-K to 8, which should have allowed Jacqueline to take all 4 of her children to the same school. She was a single mother without a car in a medium-sized city where you really need one. And to avoid rampant bullying on the school bus, Jacqueline used public transportation to shepherd her 4 children along multiple bus lines to get them to and from school safely every day. Jacqueline patched together a complex system of help from local charities and publicly funded supports to provide for her family. When most people saw vulnerability, I saw a woman who was overburdened and under-resourced. Labeling families like Jacqueline's vulnerable to some unnamed threat distracts from the source of their daily challenges. In Jacqueline's case, we can start with the inequality that gave rise to a life that gave a life to a failed education system in which choice is now framed as the act of shuttling poor children of color to multiple schools across the city, rather than walking down the street to a good neighborhood like their white counterparts. Or we can point to a public transportation system that is so broken that only the people who would have no other options can rely on it. And we can't forget economic and criminal justice policies that led to a steep decline in family-sustaining jobs in urban centers and the mass incarceration of men like the 2 fathers of Jacqueline's children, to name a few. Shifting our attention away from individual families and towards systemic and structural inequality forces us to rethink the policy solutions we propose and the strategies we employ to achieve them. It turns out that using terms like vulnerable and at risk is also counterproductive. Years of messaging research conducted by Frameworks Institute found that people are less likely to take action to end poverty when the problem is framed as an issue of vulnerability. Describing children and families as vulnerable actually compelled study participants either to see poverty as unsolvable, or worse yet, blame families for being poor. A colleague of mine used to work at a children's advocacy organization in Washington State that decided to stop using vulnerable and at risk to describe children and families a few years ago for similar reasons, because it failed to put the family at the center. Similar to the shift in referring to children with disabilities rather than disabled children, this organization moved away from using adjectives to singularly define families. They now use the term families furthest from opportunity. I have swapped vulnerable for overburdened and under-resourced. At the end of the day, that's what children and families living in poverty have to manage. The overabundance of challenges caused by structural inequality, paired with the insufficient resources to tackle those challenges. Overburdened and under-resourced can be a mouthful, so I often shorten it to our, O-U-R. Maybe thinking of children and families in poverty as our children and families will compel all of us to think of solving poverty as our collective responsibility.